Vice President J.D. Vance and his delegation were engaged in 21 hours of high-stakes negotiations with Iran. President Trump flew to Miami to enjoy the UFC's light heavyweight championship fight. It was unclear whether the president knew that negotiations had failed by the time he entered the arena, with Kid Rock's American Badass as his entrance song. For the most part, Trump impassively, that's a word used by the New York Times, watched as blood and saliva sprayed out from the fighters in front of him. He also took a moment to speak with UFC commentator and podcaster Joe Rogan. What they discussed is unclear, but the brief exchange follows Rogan's recent criticism and repeated criticism of Trump's war with Iran. That appearance precedes a planned UFC-style cage match on the White House lawn to celebrate America's 250th birthday on June 14th. Yes, that was a real sentence, which also marks Trump's 80th birthday.
That New York Times story.
Can you read that graph?
Yeah, I have it pulled up right here. That New York Times story, if you haven't read it, you've got to read it. Here's a key detailed paragraph. After a week spent largely out of sight, but lashing out at his enemies on social media, Mr. Trump's resurfacing at a match seemed designed to provide him with a soothing balm of male aggression, musky sweat, and cheering supporters, not unlike one of his political rallies, just with shirtless fighters. Right there.
Bravo.
Is superbly written. But also ridiculous. Gross. He should be in the Situation Room. If he's serious at all about a deal, although he said before going to Florida,
he don't care.
Can make a deal, not make a deal.
He's proving that he doesn't care. He said, because if you thought maybe that was just bluster, we can have a deal or not, I don't really care. He's obviously proving to the American people, to the world, that he doesn't really care, because otherwise he would at least pretend to be. Right. If not in the Situation Room, just at the White House. Hell, he could even be at his winter White House, hanging out, pretending that at the end of the day, he is paying attention to what's happening out of there, because there is no one who would be able to, if anyone's able to get reports out of the room, it would be Donald Trump, the president of the United States. I will also say it's really rich, because Donald Trump spent a lot of time during the Biden administration complaining about Biden going to Delaware. And what the Biden White House used to say, and we had to go with him. We spent a lot of time in Delaware. But what the Biden White House used to say is that he can be president from anywhere. So that is absolutely true. Yep. But I don't think we saw a little Situation Room sitting next to Joe Rogan where he can pop in if he needed to, if something happened. What if something happened? I just think that it is shocking, not surprising, that he chose to hang out there because he needs the adulation. Adulation?
Adulation.
Adulation. Thank you very much. My dictionary's here. Adulation. Exactly. But the adulation of a crowd, because he hasn't been getting that recently. What he's been getting is like poll after poll saying that what he's doing is wrong, Joe Rogan running away from him, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, good. I'm sorry, Jackie.
Well, I would just like to know a little bit more about the Joe Rogan conversation. I don't believe that Joe Rogan was one of the people that he called out in his screed this week against the MAGA-lectuals, as I've come to call them, who have decided to turn against him over the war in Iran. Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Marjorie Taylor Greene, those were some of the people that he called out by name. Yeah. Alex Jones said that, basically repeated his talking points that he is MAGA, they're not MAGA, and basically to ignore them, and that he didn't care about what they had to say.
But he tweeted about
Joe Rogan is someone who's really interesting because he speaks to an audience that's a little bit different than the audience that Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson speak to. He talks to those independent voters, those previously disengaged male white voters who maybe never voted for Trump before, a lot of first-time voters, just a very different crew than the base. And I wonder what that conversation was like and if he tried to change Joe Rogan's mind.
That picture that we just had up, I think, is interesting. Who needed that picture out there more? Did Joe Rogan need it, or did the president need it more?
The president, 100%. 100%. He's trying to show people that they're still friends, when at the end of the day, next week, if the war is still going on and there's no real ceasefire and the negotiations are where they're at, Joe Rogan's probably going to talk about that on his podcast. He's not going to change his tune.
Yeah.
You have to leave it there, though.